Classic Restos is proudly brought to you by Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts, Hare and Forbes Machinery House, and Pace Farm. I'm standing outside of the once-was location of Australia's largest American car and memorabilia collection, the home of Lost in the 50's Museum. It was owned by car guy Glen Jennings. Where is he now? Well, let's find out on this week's episode of Classic Restos. In a quite leafy suburb near Newcastle in New South Wales, Glen and his wife Kelly enjoy a slightly less paced life these days. Each day is their own to decide how to spend it. While Glen's security business ticks along in the background, grandson William also plays an integral part of their lives, and William's passion for all things cars is just as strong. Glen's successes in security are not to be sneezed at either. Over the decades, Glen and his team have looked after some famous greats, to the likes of Michael Jackson, Jerry Seinfeld, Olivia Newton-John, and U2, and has now developed a personal association with Kostya Zoo, and nowadays his son. The Lost in the 50's Museum was an incredible place. The gobsmacking, leave you in awe experience will never leave those who were lucky enough to see it. Classic Restos had 2 exclusive chances to film episodes there in the past. You can find them on the Shannons Club. Click on videos and simply do a search in the bar provided. Glen's once-was collection was eclectic and equivalent to almost any automotive museum that you would see abroad, with the condition of most being simply outstanding. Motor cars that were full size, dripping in chrome, outlandish shapes that almost self-sculptured the landscape as they drove along the American highways and the byways. Cars that were in most cases above the average American's reach, in a time when movie stars graced the big screens and the adornment of fame worked in unison as a perfect match with the vehicles they were seen in. A time when vehicle designers must have laid in bed each night thinking of what new line or shape they could incorporate the next day at work, when their sharp HB pencil hit their drawing board just after their second cup of coffee. A time when the war was on between vehicle manufacturers. It was a race year after year to see who looked the most modern, who had the most power in their engines, who had the features, and that list went on to hopefully result in the biggest sales years ever. Glen Jennings, like many of us, lives the dream. He understands the passion. It's a nice illness to have, one that seems there is no antidote for. How hard was it to sell over 100 cars? It must have been terribly hard, because even now there are still a few left.
I guess from a personal point of view, the sale of my collection, over 100 cars, was very emotional and some days difficult. But there was always going to be a time, and when the time came, it was just a process that we had to go through. Fortunately for me, I managed to retain a few special ones, and I get to continue on my relationship with the American cars. I think right from word go, growing up in Australia, I was like so many kids that grew up with matchbox cars, and as you know, a lot of them were the American cars that we never physically got to see, but we did see on TV. And I had this intrigue and this excitement that grew with that period of time in America. It was all so colourful and bright, and it was a hook for me back then as a kid, and it to this day is still there. Even though the Australian cars were in some cases 10, 15 years behind in the production run of things. They were an orphan of the American cars on a lesser scale. We didn't have the drive. We didn't have. I don't know how to explain that. The American car manufacturing in that era was anything was possible, and everything was possible, and they took everything to the limit. When the Australian cars started to be produced, they were on a much more workman type scale, which I guess fits in with the Australia that it was in the day. The Australian market back in the day, you have to remember, 1955 in Australia, we had a scarce population. We were ruled by the British colonial system, and we just didn't have, there was no entrepreneurs out there like in America running off starting their own car manufacturing company. So we really did get the bare bones of the automotive industry back in the day, and it wasn't really until the 60s and 70s that the Australian cars started to get some imagination behind them and flourish. Having said that, even the most mundane of the early Australian cars today are hugely sought after collectibles. So just a different genre, a different time frame, and certainly from the guys that were sitting and drawing the cars in America and bringing them to fruition, we hadn't even engaged on building the cars at that stage. I don't know if I ever thought about the word museum. That came along later. In actual fact, all it was, Fletch, was my burning passion for American cars and Americana in general forced my hand somewhat. I had cars stored in multiple locations, and on many times I'd like to go and get a particular car out and just gave up in frustration and stormed off because it was buried behind 10 or 12 others. And it just got to a point where I said to my wife one day, either I'm going to have to sell off a big chunk of this collection or find somewhere where I can place them, where I can access them. And even at that stage, there was no thought about putting them on display. So I went about looking for the right shed in the right location. And the rest is sort of history. We always set about putting the cars down there to access and finally getting to put my memorabilia up, which ended up some crazy number, just under 10,000 pieces at its peak. So we had 2 years of retrofitting this beautiful shed, brought all the cars down, placed all the memorabilia, and it started to look like a museum. And I didn't show anybody. It was a bit of a secret. It was a fun time putting that all together. And then I had an opening with my friends and family, and they were all a bit gobsmacked. And those that hadn't been in and out, because I did restrict the admission in the early days, just said to me, "You've got to show this. This is too good not to show." So we compromised. It really wasn't what I wanted to do. We compromised with 1 day a month, an advertised open day, and we had that for 7 years, and every open day was literally a sellout.
When I was a kid, I loved cars.
I've been a motoring enthusiast all my life.
My life is hot rods, designing them, building them, and racing.
Hand-built with a stainless steel roof.
It won the Monte Carlo Rally 4 times.
Like Dad, I've always been a Ford man.
In '71, this was the fastest four-door car in the world.
Insurance? Shannons, of course.
In 2020, why not consider a Detroit tour with Fletch? Detroit, the automotive epicenter. It will leave you gobsmacked. Imagine experiencing where automotive history on a grand scale began. Stay in fine accommodation, taking in some of the best museums and private car collections on the planet. Book your 2020 Detroit tour with Fletch.
That jacket is just causing me some vision problems.
I've worn it for you. The whole point of today's episode and the attire that was chosen had you in mind.
Because of the colour of the museum, lost in the 50s, or the fact that we're both Wiggles supporters?
No, because it's just the fact that it's the pants I choose my shirt by. I'm a man of stance. Speaking of which, have you got any regrets that you've got rid of the museum as such?
Oh, I don't have regrets. Some days I think about, wonder where those cars are or what's going on, but I think overall, no regrets. Time was right.
Must be horribly emotional for you.
It can be. I mean, it was a part of a wonderful journey. I mean, I can never discount how much fun was involved in putting it together, and it all went like that. so quickly during the auction process. But I think the time was right, and when it is time to go, it's better just to cut it quick.
From a personal perspective, you mind me asking you, you've done some great things, you're very successful, you're by no means an old man in life, you've still got a lot of life left. Being successful, how does it feel? Do you often sit back and look at what you've accomplished, and what sort of feeling does that give you?
I've been blessed. I've been blessed with a beautiful family and grandkids now. As you go through life, one thing I have learned is that, you have a degrees of success, but how do you measure that? I don't necessarily think it's all money, Fletch. It's a lifestyle. It's the ability and the friendships and the chance to enjoy what you've done and succeeded in. But my business still keeps on going to this day. It's keeps me busy, and that keeps me young.
I've got to say, I've followed you for a part of this journey, particularly since the inception of Lost in the 50's, and I'm proud to be able to say that I've done that. There's not too many individuals in Australia when it comes to classic cars, and especially American classic cars, that have done what you have done at the level you have done. You have entertained so many car clubs, you have stood for so many great things. I know there's car clubs out there back in the day that couldn't wait to drive to your premises. And even at time of auction, well, we know how many people turned up. So really, it was the heartthrob for so many enthusiasts to know under one roof that they could drive to your place.
Oh, look, I still and will always appreciate those kind words about what we achieved. And yes, the museum struck a chord with so many people on so many different levels, and not just car people. I often remember the wives used to come along, and they weren't necessarily car engaged, and they would walk out the door saying they had the best day ever. And of course the husbands would be down there talking about the engines, and the wives would be looking at the Elvis memorabilia. So we set out right from word go about taking a piece of Americana and bringing the weird and the wonderful to Australia for Australians to enjoy, and I know we achieved that. And it's validated with the auction results. Fletch, we sold 100%. Every car, every piece of memorabilia found a new home, which validates the fact that people liked my stuff more than perhaps I did. So this afternoon we'll get to have a look at a few of the cars that never made the auction block, and there are different reasons as to why. The big guy right behind me here, which most of you will recognise as a 57 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz convertible. Very rare car, high dollar car, both here and in the US. Not a lot of them made. It's a 1 year off body model with a big 365 V8. Interesting, I used to talk about this car in the museum quite often about comparing to the Australian and the British cars of that era. This car has 12-way power seats, air conditioning, disc brakes, electric roof, electric parade roof, and all of this for 1957. So in terms of where we were in Australian manufacturing around the same time, I think we had a single gauge car with blinkers and seats. And that gives you a bit of a scope of how far advanced the American cars were. And part of the attraction to the American cars was the fact that they had every available buzzer and gadget that you could fit into a car. Not to mention the chrome and all of the embellishments that they were renowned for. So yeah, it's a beautiful car. It's one of the highest level collector cars out there today. Two reasons why it probably stayed with us. One, I don't think that the Australian market could support the price that the car's worth, nor would I think that it would be overly recognised for what it's worth in Australia. It would be one of the cars that if I ever was to decide to move it on, which I don't think I would, it would go back to the United States to achieve its correct value. This room is our little 50s showroom. It came about primarily from my grandson, who, as a consequence of selling everything at the museum, didn't quite understand where all Pa's cars and all Pa's toys had gone. So I didn't want him to miss out on that wonderful experience. So it wasn't difficult to retain some of the items from the museum and resurrect it here on a small scale. So it brings me a nice, happy, warm feeling to come out here, and it's a little example of what we had at Lost in the 50's. And for my grandkids, it's something that they can grow up with and they'll always have fond memories of as well.
And if you own a classic or memorabilia, make sure that it's insured with Shannons. Why not pick up the phone and give Shannons a call for a quote and a chat on 134646. And if you're enjoying classic restos, there are over 330 episodes awaiting you on the Shannons Club, along with a whole heap of other cool stuff to browse through. To find out more, visit shannons.com.au.
Every weekend around Australia, motoring enthusiasts get together to share their passion for cars and bikes. It's a passion that brings us together. All sorts of people, all sorts of cars and bikes, from the classics of today to the classics of tomorrow. At Shannons, we understand enthusiasts, so when it comes to insurance, it's got to be Shannons. Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts. Call 13 46 46 for a quote.
Hare & Forbes Machinery House has been family owned and operated for over 85 years, and it's easy to see why. Planning on welding? Look at these welding tables and clamps, air compressors and different air tools, sandblasting cabinets, through to spray guns. Everyone is welcome at Machinery House. There are competitive freight rates around Australia, and you can buy online at machineryhouse.com.au. So remember, Hare & Forbes has the range.
So one of the questions I get asked all the time, especially when people visited the museum, was, okay, so tell us, what's your favourite out of all of these cars? Well, here she is. It's my pride and joy, 1958 Pontiac Bonneville Coupe. A very rare car in the US, even more rare here in Australia, but more so to come across one that's in this condition, an original car that's been babied from day one, spent most of its life on display in a dealership. I don't know if out of all of my cars I could say there was any better than this one. So with all of these big cruiser cars during the 50s, 55 through to about 1960, the General Motors product, including the Pontiac, had something very special about them. If you lined them up, 1958 in a row, the Oldsmobile, the Pontiac, the Cadillac, the Chevys, they had so many interchanging parts, yet each of them had their own individual style and personality. Pontiac, for me, and Oldsmobile, not far behind, were the leaders. They stood out. The Pontiac, the chrome, the embellishments, the body lines. Just take a look at the roofline on that 58 Bonneville. You don't see that too often. 1959, of course, they stretched out to the big fin cars, as we all know, the biggest of the fins, 14-inch on the Cadillac. And then 1960, not sure what happened. I think they threw all the designers out that had a lot of flair and went back to the basic type car. So for me, 58 is the penultimate year for what I call Americana. This was when the American cars reached their ultimate presentation. I don't believe you could have fitted anything more onto a 58 than you currently see today. And this girl, this beautiful Bonneville, is the top of the tree. I'll give you an example of what we're talking about for some of the late 50s cars. If you have a look at the sheer width of the top of that front fender, you'll see the rocket ship moulding right above the headlight, but look at the width of it. It's got to be probably 16 inches across. Now, you didn't see that in a lot. The Ford had them on the Tank Fairlanes, the Chryslers on the Imperial. In fact, on the Imperial, if you open the bonnet, you literally have like a coffee table set up left and right and across the front of the car, looking into the engine bay. These cars, some people used to laugh about, they said it was designed for the mechanics to be comfortable working on them as they leaned into the engine bay. Now, if you think this car is spectacular outside, just take a moment to look at the interior of this Bonneville and this era. It's never to be seen again, and quite rare, even on a lot of the American cars, to find interiors of this quality. Take a note of the gold fleck throughout the carpet. That came as a factory original carpet laced with gold fleck. The seating also has a gold reflective fleck that comes out through the tubing and the piping around the seats. Even the door panels on the 58 Bonneville have a bright reflective tinge through them. It's something that you didn't see on a lot of cars, only on the high-enders. And the Bonneville, for example, is one, the Biarritz Cadillac is another, the Oldsmobile 98, and of course the Chrysler Imperial, of which I am very lucky to be a Chrysler Imperial owner, and they are another story for another day that really deserve a lot more time to be talked about. The 58 Bonneville has the big 370 Pontiac, so much power, so much down grunt. These cars are remarkable to drive. Along with the 57 Biarritz Cadillac, along with the Imperial, all of these cars are supported by automatic transmissions that for the day are quite remarkable. It's near impossible to feel a change of gear in these big cruisers. You can be plodding along the road and actually put your foot down to go back through the gears and you'll feel nothing. It's all part and parcel of the way they were designed. The Buicks, the Cadillacs, all of the GM range, they were just marvellous for their transmissions. And even today, all of these cars, majority of, have original transmissions from the day, a testament to just how well they were built. What a lot of people don't realise, the term land yacht, which was given to most of these late 50s cruisers simply because most were 20 foot long plus, but quite often most of them weighed over 2 tonne. And the big difference is, if you put it into terms for the layman, is that those that drive trucks will tell you that if they have a fully loaded truck, how better it sits on the road, how better it feels on the road, and overall transmission performance is better loaded. So these cars, oddly enough, were built heavier to allow for that feel. So given the opportunity to ride in a Cadillac, as some of you may well have done, or in my Bonneville, or in Fletch's Imperial, you will notice that it has this almost wave-like suspension feeling. And that comes about because the suspension and transmission are set to accommodate potentially a 2.5 tonne body. Down at the museum we had the big 1960 Lincoln, the heaviest of the cars, and it had it in spades. To drive that car just felt like you're floating on water. And as you go back into the weights and the cars become lighter, you'll lose that fluffy, wavy feeling. Just magnificent designing. Again, something that we'll never see again. There's no cars produced today on the road that weigh over 2 tonne. So we hang on to these big old girls in all their glory. They offer us something from an era long gone by that we'll never ever see again. So for our final car of the day in our little showroom here, look right over my shoulder and you, like me, will probably start dribbling. It is, of course, the iconic America's favourite sports car, the 1963 split window Corvette. I've had this car a long, long time and it'll probably be with me until I say hasta la vista. But these are a very special car. They have reached prices in America that nobody would ever think of. In fact, just a month ago at Barrett-Jackson in Las Vegas, the same car, same colour, same year, 63 split windows, sold for an amazing $265,000 US plus commissions on the block. Now, not saying we're ever going to reach those massive prices here in Australia, that would be silly to think, but as an investment car and investment value, you can't go wrong. Now, all that aside, we can't discount the fact that it is America's greatest sports car. And for the split window, identified purely because the rear window does have a panel down the centre that separates it, giving it the name split window, it doesn't change from any of the other era 1963 Corvettes, apart from the fact that there was a limited run of them with the split window. My car is a 3-speed 327 manual, great little performance car, drives like you're on a set of rails, typical of the American Corvettes, nice and quick, very responsive, and a beautiful little car. Wherever I take it, wherever show I go to, it's always a favourite, and it was very much a favourite in the museum in terms of the most popular cars photographed down there. Today, when you do see them come up for auction, they do command big dollars. I'm very proud to say that I own one, very proud to have had this one for a very, very long time, and look forward to keeping it for a lot longer. So from time to time you do get some people, commenting about the handling and the steering on some of these cars, and I often refer just back to, I pick one year out, for example, that comes to mind, 1960 Le Mans, where the Corvette took on the Porsches and the Ferraris, and in terms of handling and steering and wrapping around corners, wow, it's very difficult to tell me that the Americans didn't know how to build a car that could go around corners at great speed, and the Corvette proved it time and time again. And to this day, right up to today's current release of the new C8, handling is just magnificent. Jump in any Corvette anywhere in the world and you try it. Hit a corner at a good rate of speed and just see how well it hangs onto them rails. They are along up there with the pony cars and a lot of the American cars that prove themselves on the racetracks, that not only could they perform, but they sure knew how to handle. So have a good look around at this 63 and you'll notice some of the design features on this car, different to the earlier 61 and 62 Corvettes. This is very much a sleek design. Some people refer to this as almost looking like a Buick from the back with the glass, the way it's set up, or even the Barracudas, early Barracudas. So they all had this little bit of, touch and go, which way should we lean? Do we take a little bit of this, a little bit of that? And you end up with this beautiful product. This car, believe it or not, is a 63 sports car, still has plenty of chrome, beautiful badging, beautiful lines, always going to be stamped as the 63 split window because of that rear window. But there were so many options. This car went right through to 1967, and some of the car options, the big block cars, the automatic transmissions, the big block racing cars in these today are just out of this. Most people could never afford them. They've been known to sell upwards of $500,000 for the rare ones. So we are now talking about the A-grade collector cars, and the 63 Corvette split window sits right up there in the top of the tree in terms of collectability.
Well, I hope you've really enjoyed this week's episode of Classic Restos. Where's Glen Jennings now? And it's good to see that he is still keeping the dream alive. As I say at the end of every episode of Classic Restos, until next week, no matter where you're watching the show from, please ride and drive safe. I'm Fletch, and I thank you very much for watching. You can like and follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ClassicRestosTV and watch catch-up episodes at shannons.com.au. Classic Restos is proudly brought to you by Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts, Hare and Forbes Machinery House, and Pace Farm.